The sound of heavy machinery rumbled through the otherwise quiet suburban neighborhood of Oak Ridge Estates on that sweltering June morning. James Mitchell stood in his backyard, arms crossed over his chest, watching with a mixture of relief and anticipation as the excavator's metal claw tore into the cracked concrete surrounding his aging in-ground pool. After 15 years of endless maintenance, chemical balancing, and thousands of dollars in repairs, he finally made the decision that many homeowners eventually face. The pool had to go. "Should have done this years ago," James muttered to himself, wiping sweat from his brow. The foreman of the demolition crew had just explained that they'd be finishing the concrete removal today, then filling the hole with clean soil tomorrow, followed by sod installation by the end of the week. Within days, his backyard would transform from a money pit into a spacious lawn where his grandchildren could play without him worrying about safety hazards. James had done everything by the book. He researched reputable pool removal companies, obtained the proper permits from the city, which now sat in a clearly marked folder on his kitchen counter, notified his homeowner's insurance, and even sent courtesy notes to his immediate neighbors explaining the upcoming work and apologizing for any temporary noise disruption. The demolition company had assured him the project would be completed within 5 days, weather permitting. What James hadn't anticipated was the reaction from Helen Winters, the neighbor 2 doors down who had appointed herself the unofficial enforcer of neighborhood aesthetics, despite not holding any actual position on the Homeowners Association board. James was inspecting the progress with the foreman when a shrill voice cut through the mechanical rumble of equipment. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" He turned to see Helen marching across his lawn, her highlighted bob haircut bouncing with each determined step, designer sunglasses pushed atop her head, and a phone clutched tightly in her manicured hand. Behind her trailed her small Yorkshire Terrier on a pink rhinestone leash, the poor creature struggling to keep pace with its owner's righteous indignation. "Good morning, Helen," James said evenly, already sensing the confrontation brewing. "As I mentioned in the note I left in your mailbox last week, I'm having my pool removed." Helen's face contorted with disbelief. "You can't just remove a pool. Do you have any idea what this will do to property values in our neighborhood? My sister is a real estate agent, and she says homes with pools sell for at least 15% more." The foreman glanced uncertainly between James and the irate woman, clearly wondering if he should continue working or wait until the confrontation concluded. "I have all the necessary permits, Helen," James explained calmly, gesturing toward his house. "And I've owned this home for over 20 years. I'm well within my rights to make changes to my own backyard." Helen's eyes narrowed dangerously. "We'll see about that. The HOA has rules about major property alterations. This is absolutely unacceptable." She began furiously tapping at her phone screen. "I'm calling Patricia right now. She's on the board and she'll put a stop to this immediately." James sighed deeply, maintaining his composure despite the growing frustration. He'd anticipated some resistance, perhaps a raised eyebrow or two from neighbors who enjoyed occasional invitations to use his pool during summer gatherings, but nothing like the nuclear reaction Helen was having. "The HOA bylaws don't prohibit pool removals, Helen. I checked before I started the project," he said, his voice remarkably steady. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to discuss the next steps with the contractor." But Helen wasn't budging. Instead, she raised her phone to eye level and began taking photos of the construction site, the workers, and even James himself. "This is going on the neighborhood Facebook page," she announced triumphantly. "Everyone needs to see what you're doing to destroy our community's appeal. And I'm calling the city inspector. I highly doubt you have the proper permits for this travesty." Little did Helen know, her dramatic stand was only the opening salvo in what would become the neighborhood saga of the summer, one that would ultimately leave her reputation, not James' backyard, in ruins. By the following afternoon, Helen's campaign against James' pool removal had escalated to proportions that seemed almost comical, if they weren't so destructive. She created a post in the neighborhood's private Facebook group titled "Emergency: Property Values Under Attack," complete with dramatic photos of the excavation work and doom-laden predictions about the devastating impact of removing a premium amenity from the street. Several neighbors had actually stopped by James' house, not to complain, but to check if everything was all right after seeing Helen's increasingly frantic social media posts. Most seemed surprised to learn the reality was far less dramatic than Helen had portrayed. "So you're just removing your old pool?" asked Mike Peterson from across the street, looking confused as he glanced between the ongoing work and James' calm demeanor. "The way Helen described it, I thought you were installing some kind of industrial waste facility back here." James chuckled, offering Mike a cold beer from the cooler he'd set up on his patio. "Just getting rid of a 15-year headache. My grandkids visit more often now, and between the maintenance costs and safety concerns, it just makes sense." Mike nodded thoughtfully, accepting the beer. "Makes perfect sense to me. Helen's always been, intense, about neighborhood appearances. That's putting it mildly, James replied. The workers had made impressive progress, having completely removed the concrete and begun prepping the area for soil fill-in. The foreman, Dave, approached with clipboard in hand. "We're right on schedule, Mr. Mitchell. Tomorrow we'll bring in the clean fill and start compacting it properly. Should be ready for sod by Friday." Their conversation was interrupted by the unmistakable sound of Helen's voice carrying across the yard. This time she wasn't alone. Behind her walked Patricia Coleman, the actual AHOA president, looking significantly less outraged and more apologetic than her companion. "See, they completely gutted it," Helen exclaimed, gesturing wildly at the excavation site. "This is exactly what I was telling you about Patricia." Patricia approached more slowly, her expression suggesting she'd rather be anywhere else. "Hello, James. I'm sorry to bother you," but Helen was quite insistent that I come see this situation. Before James could respond, Helen jumped in. "The HOA cannot possibly allow this to continue. It violates at least 3 bylaws about property aesthetics and neighborhood consistency." Patricia winced slightly. "Well, actually, Helen, I've reviewed our HOA agreement, and there's nothing specifically prohibiting the removal of a swimming pool, provided the proper city permits are in place." "I have all the permits right here," James offered, gesturing toward his house. "Would you like to see them?" "Permits can be forged," Helen interjected, her voice rising an octave. "And what about the water drainage, the environmental impact, the noise ordinances?" Dave the foreman stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Ma'am, we're a licensed and insured company that specializes in pool removals. We follow all city codes and environmental guidelines. We'll be finished with the heavy equipment by end of day, and the noise levels are within permitted daytime construction limits." Helen's face flushed red. "Well, I've already called the city inspector's office," she announced triumphantly. "They should be here any minute to evaluate whether this project is actually legitimate." As if on cue, a white city vehicle with the municipal logo on its door pulled up in front of James' house. A middle-aged man in khakis and a polo shirt emerged, carrying a tablet. "Is there a James Mitchell here?" he called, walking toward the backyard. James raised his hand. "That's me." The inspector approached, extending his hand. "Tom Reynolds, city inspector. I understand you're removing a pool?" "That's right," James confirmed, shaking the man's hand. Helen practically rushed toward the inspector. "Thank goodness you're here. I've been telling everyone this can't possibly be permitted properly." The inspector glanced at Helen with a neutral expression before turning back to James. "I've got your permit application pulled up here. Do you have the physical copies on hand?" "I do," James replied, heading toward the house to retrieve his folder. Helen followed closely behind the inspector, speaking rapidly about property values and neighborhood aesthetics, while Patricia hung back, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. When James returned with his permits, the inspector reviewed them carefully, compared them with the information on his tablet, and then walked the perimeter of the construction site, asking Dave several technical questions about the fill material and compaction process. After about 15 minutes, the inspector made some notes on his tablet, then looked up at the small crowd that had gathered. "Everything appears to be in order," he announced. "The permits are valid, the contractor is licensed and following proper procedures, and the project is compliant with all city codes." Helen's mouth fell open in disbelief. But what about the impact on the neighborhood?" The inspector turned to her with the patient expression of someone who had dealt with similar situations many times before. "Ma'am, homeowners have the right to make modifications to their property as long as they comply with city ordinances and any applicable HOA restrictions. Mr. Mitchell has met those requirements." As the inspector departed, Helen stood rooted to the spot, her expression a mixture of shock and mounting anger. Patricia took the opportunity to make her escape, muttering something about another appointment. "This isn't over," Helen finally declared, her voice quivering slightly. "Not by a long shot." James watched her storm off, wondering what else she might have planned and just how much more dramatic this simple home improvement project was about to become. By Thursday morning, James' backyard transformation was proceeding remarkably well. The crew had filled in the pool cavity with clean soil, compacted it properly, and were now preparing the surface for tomorrow's sod installation. The once gaping hole was now a level expanse of fresh earth, and James could already envision the lush green lawn that would soon cover it. "We'll be finished with the soil work today," Dave informed him over morning coffee. "The sod delivery is confirmed for tomorrow at 8. Barring any unforeseen circumstances, you'll have your new yard completed by tomorrow afternoon." James nodded appreciatively. "You guys have been amazing. I'm impressed with how smoothly everything's gone." Dave chuckled. "Well, the actual work has gone smoothly. Can't say the same for the neighborly relations." They both glanced toward Helen's house, where the blinds had been conspicuously drawn since yesterday's confrontation with the city inspector. The unusual silence from that direction felt less like a resolution and more like the calm before a storm. James didn't have to wait long to discover what Helen had been plotting. Around noon, as he was bringing lunch out to the work crew, a sleek black luxury SUV pulled up in front of his house. A man in an expensive suit emerged carrying a leather portfolio. "Are you James Mitchell?" the man called out, walking briskly toward the backyard. "That's me," James replied, setting down the tray of sandwiches. "What can I do for you?" The man extended a business card. "Martin Blackwell, attorney. I represent the Oak Ridge Estates Community Association." He paused, glancing at the ongoing work. "I understand you're removing a swimming pool without proper authorization from the neighborhood association." James examined the card, then looked back at the lawyer with raised eyebrows. "I have all the necessary permits from the city, and there's nothing in the HOA bylaws prohibiting pool removal. The HOA president herself was here yesterday and confirmed that." Nevertheless, Blackwell continued smoothly, "I've been retained to issue this cease and desist letter pending a full review by the HOA board." He removed an official-looking document from his portfolio and held it out. James didn't take it. "Retained by whom exactly?" "Because I spoke with Patricia Coleman yesterday, the actual HOA president, and she confirmed I'm within my rights." The lawyer's confidence seemed to waver slightly. "The letter comes from the association's legal committee." "We don't have a legal committee," James replied flatly. "Who actually hired you, Mr. Blackwell?" The awkward silence that followed was broken by the sound of Helen's front door opening. She emerged wearing a pantsuit that seemed unnecessarily formal for a weekday at home and walked purposefully toward them. "Good you're here," she said to the lawyer, completely ignoring James. Has he been served with the cease and desist? Several pieces clicked into place in James' mind. "You hired a private attorney and told him he was representing the HOA. That's fraud, Helen." The lawyer's head swiveled between them. "Ms. Winters, you assured me you were authorized to engage legal representation on behalf of the Homeowners Association." Helen lifted her chin defiantly. "I am on the Aesthetic Review Committee." "A committee of one that you appointed yourself," James interjected. "It has no official standing in the HOA." Martin Blackwell's professional demeanor began to crack as he realized this situation. "Ms. Winters, if you misrepresented your authority to engage my services." "Call Patricia Coleman," James suggested. "She's the HOA president. She'll confirm that the association did not authorize legal action against me or my properly permitted home improvement project." The lawyer's expression hardened as he turned to Helen. "We should discuss this privately, Ms. Winters." He stepped away, pulling out his phone. Helen's composure finally broke. "This is outrageous. You're destroying neighborhood property values. Someone has to stop you." "It's my property, Helen," James said calmly. "And your crusade has gone far enough." The lawyer returned, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Ms. Winters, we need to talk about the retainer you paid me under apparently false pretenses." He turned to James. "Mr. Mitchell, I apologize for the confusion. It appears there's been a misunderstanding about who my client actually is." As Blackwell led Helen away for what appeared to be an extremely uncomfortable conversation, James returned to the work crew, who had been watching the scene unfold with barely concealed amusement. Entertainment included with the job at no extra charge, it equipped accepting a sandwich from the tray. James laughed, but his relief was short-lived. Less than an hour later, as the crew was finishing the soil compaction, a new disturbance arose. This time, it was the distinctive sound of police sirens. 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of James' house, their lights flashing. 4 officers emerged and approached the backyard. "Is there a problem, officers?" James asked, walking to meet them at the edge of his property. The lead officer, a woman with a no-nonsense expression, addressed him directly. "We received a complaint about illegal excavation and potential damage to city water lines. Are you the homeowner?" Before James could answer, Helen appeared, practically running from her house. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. I've been reporting this illegal construction for days." The officer held up a hand to pause Helen's approach. "Ma'am, please wait. I'm speaking with a homeowner first." She turned back to James. "Sir, can you explain what's happening here?" "Of course," James replied calmly. "I'm having my swimming pool removed. I have all the proper permits from the city, which were verified by a city inspector just yesterday. I'd be happy to show you." "He's lying," Helen interjected. "He's doing this despite the neighborhood. There could be serious water main issues. People could be in danger." The officer's expression remained professional, but took on a hint of weariness as she glanced between Helen and James. "Sir, if you could show me those permits, please." "Certainly," James replied, heading toward his house once more to retrieve his now well-worn folder of documentation. The confrontation that followed would become neighborhood legend for years to come. When James returned with his folder of permits, the lead officer, whose nameplate identified her as Officer Chen, reviewed the documents thoroughly. She compared them with information on her department tablet, occasionally nodding to herself. "Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Mitchell," Officer Chen finally declared. "The permits are valid, and I see notes from Inspector Reynolds, who was here yesterday." Helen's face contorted in disbelief. "That's impossible. You must have falsified those documents." Officer Chen's expression remained neutral but firm. "Ma'am, falsely accusing someone of document fraud is a serious matter. The city's database confirms these permits are legitimate. Check the water lines." Helen insisted desperately. "They're probably damaged. There could be flooding at any moment." One of the other officers stepped forward. "We actually contacted the water department before responding. They confirmed there are no main lines in this section of the neighborhood that could be affected by a standard pool removal." Helen's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice again. "Well, what about the noise ordinance violations? They've been running heavy machinery at all hours." Dave, who had been standing quietly nearby, cleared his throat. "We've operated strictly between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., well within the city's permitted construction hours. We'll be finished with all heavy equipment by the end of today." Officer Chen turned to Helen, her patience visibly waning. "Ms. Winters, is it? Have you been the one making multiple complaints about this property?" Helen straightened her posture. "I am a concerned citizen protecting our neighborhood's integrity." "I see." Officer Chen made a note on her tablet. "Are you aware that making false reports to emergency services is a misdemeanor offense?" The color drained from Helen's face. "False reports? I most certainly have not. We've now responded to 3 separate calls about this address in 2 days." Officer Chen interrupted. "First for alleged permit violations, which the city inspector already cleared. Then for supposed environmental hazards, which the Environmental Safety Office dismissed this morning." "That was you too," James interjected, genuinely surprised. "And now for emergency water line concerns that don't exist," Officer Chen continued. "Each time our resources are diverted from actual emergencies." One of the younger officers leaned toward Helen. "Ma'am, you called the non-emergency line first to report this, and when you were told there was no violation, you called 911 claiming there was imminent danger of flooding." A small crowd of neighbors had begun to gather on the sidewalk, watching the unfolding scene with undisguised interest. Patricia Coleman, the HOA president, pushed through to the front, her expression a mixture of concern and embarrassment. "Officers, is everything all right?" she asked. Officer Chen acknowledged her with a nod. "You are." "Patricia Coleman, HOA president for Oak Ridge Estates," she replied. "Is there a problem with Mr. Mitchell's pool removal? I reviewed it yesterday and found nothing in violation of our community guidelines." Helen turned on Patricia, her voice shrill. "You're supposed to be protecting our property values. Do your job." Patricia's normally diplomatic expression hardened. "My job is to enforce our actual bylaws, Helen, not your personal preferences. The board fully reviewed this project yesterday afternoon in an emergency session you demanded, and we unanimously determined it was within guidelines." "You had a board meeting without me?" Helen gasped. "After you misrepresented yourself to that poor attorney this morning, we thought it best," Patricia replied coolly. Officer Chen cleared her throat. "Ms. Winters, I'm issuing you a warning for misuse of emergency services." She handed Helen an official-looking form. "Any further false reports regarding this property will result in a citation and possible fine." Helen stared at the paper in shock. This is outrageous. I'm a taxpayer. "So are the people with actual emergencies whose assistance was delayed by these false reports," Officer Chen replied evenly. Another patrol car pulled up and a senior officer stepped out. He approached the group with a look of recognition when he spotted Helen. "Ms. Winters," he said with a sigh. "I thought I recognized the address. We've spoken before about neighborhood complaints, haven't we?" Helen suddenly became very interested in her shoes. The senior officer turned to Officer Chen. "What's the situation here?" "Multiple unfounded complaints about a permitted pool removal, Captain," she reported. "We've issued a warning for misuse of emergency services." The captain nodded. "Ms. Winters was involved in similar situations with the Johnson family's fence installation last year and the Garcias shed the year before that." A murmur rippled through the gathered neighbors. James could see several people exchanging knowing glances. "Perhaps it's time for that community mediation we discussed previously," the captain suggested to Helen. "The department offers a neighborhood dispute resolution program that might be helpful." "I don't need mediation," Helen snapped. "I need neighbors who care about property values." Patricia stepped forward. "Actually, Helen, as HOA president, I'm formally requesting that you participate in the mediation program. We've had numerous complaints about your approach to neighborhood concerns. Complaints? About me? Helen looked genuinely shocked. Several neighbors nodded in confirmation, no longer bothering to hide their agreement with Patricia's statement. As the officers prepared to leave, Captain Roberts handed James his card. If there are any further issues, please contact me directly, Mr. Mitchell. James accepted the card with gratitude. Thank you, officers. I appreciate your thoroughness. Helen stood rooted to the spot, clutching the warning notice, her face a mixture of fury and disbelief as the police departed. The crowd of neighbors began to disperse, many stopping to express support to James on their way back to their homes. Dave approached James with an impressed whistle. 20 years in this business, and that was definitely one for the books. James could only nod in agreement as he watched Helen retreat to her house, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle her decorative window frames. The following Friday morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for completing James' backyard transformation. The sod delivery truck arrived precisely at 8, and by mid-morning, the crew had begun laying the lush green carpet over the prepared soil. The change was remarkable. What had once been a deteriorating pool was rapidly becoming an expansive, inviting lawn. We should be finished by early afternoon, Dave informed James as they surveyed the progress. Then we'll set up the sprinkler system on a timer. You'll want to water 3 times daily for the first 2 weeks to help the sod establish roots. James nodded, already envisioning his grandchildren playing on the grass during their scheduled visit that weekend. It looks incredible. Hard to believe there was ever a pool here. As the morning progressed, several neighbors stopped by to check out the transformation and, not incidentally, to discuss yesterday's dramatic confrontation with Helen. The incident had become instant neighborhood folklore. She's been quiet since yesterday, reported Mike from across the street, who had brought over coffee for James and donuts for the work crew. Hasn't even updated the neighborhood Facebook page, which might be a first. James shrugged. Hopefully she's realized it's time to let it go. His optimism proved premature. Around noon, as the crew was laying the final sections of sod, a sleek sit-in with a real estate company logo pulled into James' driveway. A professional-looking woman in a business suit emerged, carrying a portfolio similar to the one the lawyer had brandished the previous day. Mr. Mitchell, she called, approaching the backyard. I'm Stephanie Keller from Premier Estates Realty. You have a moment to talk? James exchanged a wary glance with Dave before responding. What can I do for you, Miss Keller? I specialize in luxury properties in this area, she explained, extending a business card. I understand you've recently made some changes to your property, and I wanted to discuss how this might affect your home's market position. Before James could respond, a familiar voice called out from the direction of Helen's house. He's removing valuable features and destroying property values, Stephanie, just like I told you. Helen was marching across her lawn toward them, looking triumphant. Show him the comparables we discussed. The realtor looked increasingly uncomfortable. Ms. Winters called our office expressing concerns about neighborhood valuations, she explained to James. She was quite insistent that I come out immediately. James sighed. Let me guess, she told you I was tanking property values by removing my pool, and she wants you to convince me I'm making a terrible mistake. The realtor blinked in surprise. That's essentially accurate, yes. And did she happen to mention that my pool was cracked, leaking, and would have cost over $25,000 to repair properly? James asked. She did not, the realtor replied slowly. Or that I have grandchildren who visit regularly, and I was concerned about safety? No. Or that the pool was rarely used in recent years, consumed thousands in maintenance and chemicals, and significantly increased my homeowner's insurance. The realtor glanced at her portfolio, then back at Helen, who had now reached them. Ms. Winters primarily emphasized the negative impact on surrounding property values. James nodded. And as a real estate professional, what's your actual assessment of how this change affects my home's value? Stephanie hesitated, glancing between James and Helen. Well, it's complicated. While swimming pools can increase a property's value in some markets, they can actually be a deterrent for many buyers who don't want the maintenance, safety concerns, or insurance costs. A well-landscaped yard often appeals to a broader market segment. Helen's face fell. But you said, I said I'd come take a look, the realtor corrected gently. And honestly, this is a beautiful transformation. She gestured at the nearly completed lawn. Many families with children or pets would consider this a significant upgrade. James couldn't help but smile at Helen's crestfallen expression. Thank you for your professional opinion, Ms. Keller. The final blow to Helen's campaign came from an unexpected source. As the realtor was preparing to leave, an elderly couple approached from the house on the other side of Helen's. James, is it all right if we come see your new yard? Called Mr. Rodriguez, who had lived in the neighborhood even longer than James. Of course, come on back, James replied. The Rodriguez couple made their way to the backyard, nodding appreciatively at the transformation. "This looks wonderful," Mrs. Rodriguez commented. "So much more practical than that old pool." "We've been thinking of doing the same thing," Mr. Rodriguez added to Helen's visible horror. "Our pool hasn't been used since the grandkids grew up. It's just become a money pit." Helen's mouth fell open. "Ernest, you can't be serious. Your pool is one of the nicest on the block, and it costs us a fortune every month," Mrs. Rodriguez replied matter-of-factly. "We're too old to use it regularly, and the maintenance is becoming a burden." Mr. Rodriguez turned to James. "Would you mind sharing the contact information for your contractor? Their work looks excellent." "Of course," James replied, gesturing to Dave, who was already reaching for his business cards. "Dave and his team have been fantastic." Helen stood frozen, watching as her campaign against James's pool removal not only failed but threatened to spark a neighborhood trend. Her expression suggested she was calculating just how many property value percentage points might be at stake if multiple pools disappeared from Oak Ridge Estates. The realtor seized the opportunity to make a graceful exit. "It was nice meeting you all. Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez, if you're considering making changes to your property, I'd be happy to provide a market analysis before and after." As the gathered neighbors continued to admire the new lawn, Helen finally retreated, walking stiffly back to her house without another word. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the transformation was complete. The crew had packed up their equipment, the sprinkler system was installed and programmed, and James' backyard had been entirely reborn. Where the troublesome pool had once dominated the space, a beautiful expanse of green now invited relaxation and play. "All finished, Mr. Mitchell," Dave announced, handing over care instructions for the new sod. "It's been an interesting job, to say the least." James laughed as he shook Dave's hand. "That's one way to put it. Thanks for your patience with all the neighborhood drama." As the work trucks pulled away, James settled into a patio chair with a cold drink, admiring his new yard in the late afternoon sunlight. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter. "Kids are excited to see the new yard tomorrow. Should we bring the soccer ball?" James smiled as he replied with an enthusiastic yes, followed by a series of exclamation points that would have made his teenage grandchildren roll their eyes. Later that evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood, James noticed Helen in her garden, ostensibly pruning roses but clearly positioned to observe his yard. He considered the dramatic events of the past week, the confrontations, the false reports, the parade of officials Helen had summoned to his property, and made a decision. Gathering a small plate of his homemade cookies and a peace offering of information on pool maintenance cost reductions, James walked across the lawns toward his troubled neighbor. Some might have considered it a foolish mission of mercy after everything she put him through. But James understood something about Helen that perhaps she didn't even recognize in herself. Her desperate need to control her surroundings came from a place of fear. Fear of change, fear of declining property values, and perhaps fear of the inevitable transformations that time brings to all things, including neighborhoods and the people who live in them. Whether his gesture would make any difference remained to be seen. But as James crossed the invisible boundary between their properties, he reflected that sometimes being a good neighbor meant extending grace even when it wasn't deserved, especially when dealing with a neighborhood Karen who had just been thoroughly shut down by the collective forces of law, reason, and community. Besides, the look on Helen's face when he invited her to his grandchildren's soccer game in the new backyard would be priceless.